My brother Julian stood up at our Thanksgiving table, clinked his crystal wine glass with that practiced confidence of someone who thinks that they're about to change their life, and announced, with the kind of smile you see on a poker player holding a royal flush, that our parents had secretly transferred control of my company to him. "You're relieved of your duties, Tamsin," he said, looking me dead in the eye across the roasted turkey and cranberry sauce. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you out Monday morning if necessary." I took a slow sip of my Cabernet Sauvignon, set the glass down carefully on the ivory linen tablecloth, and watched my father's face. The thing about playing chess is knowing when your opponent thinks they've won. Darius Whitfield thought he'd just checkmated me. He had no idea the game was already over. My name is Tamsin Whitfield, and I am 34 years old. I never thought my own flesh and blood would try to steal my life's work right over the holiday dinner table. But here we are. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. The dining room of my parents' mansion smelled of sage stuffing and roasted turkey, but the atmosphere was suffocating. We were gathered at the Whitfield estate in a wealthy Connecticut suburb for what was supposed to be a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. The antique chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the Wedgwood china and sterling silver flatware, projecting the perfect picture of an American family in harmony. But beneath the surface, it was a shark tank, and I had been swimming with predators my entire life. I'd spent the last 8 years as a freelance logistics consultant, grinding away at impossible deadlines before forming EcoShift Logistics LLC 5 years ago. That company became my entire world. I sacrificed my late 20s and early 30s, skipped countless vacations, worked 90-hour weeks in freezing warehouses, and built something real, something substantial. Annual revenue had just crossed $8.5 million. We'd become the go-to supply chain management firm for major retail clients across the Northeast. And now, sitting across from me at this Thanksgiving table, was the man who thought he could take it all away. Julian is 31, only 3 years younger than me, but you'd never know it from the way our parents treated us growing up. While I was building an actual business from nothing, he was bouncing between get-rich-quick schemes. One lucky real estate flip that netted him $200,000 had convinced him he was the next Warren Buffett. A consulting gig that paid $50,000 had inflated his ego beyond all recognition. My younger brother was wearing a suit that probably cost $3,000, money he definitely didn't earn himself. The Rolex on his wrist caught the candlelight as he gestured dramatically, pulling a thick legal envelope from his tailored jacket. "Mom, Dad and I had a long talk about the future of this family," Julian continued, tossing the envelope onto the center of the table with theatrical flair. It landed right next to the gravy boat, disrupting the careful presentation my mother had spent hours arranging. They realized that for the wealth of this family to truly be protected and grow, the business needs to be in the hands of someone with real vision, someone who can take it to the next level. He paused for effect, making sure every eye was on him. They've officially transferred their 51% controlling interest in EcoShift Logistics over to me. As of yesterday morning, I am the majority shareholder. His smile grew wider, more predatory. "And my first official act as the new Chief Executive Officer is to inform you, sister, that you are relieved of your duties. You can clear out your desk Monday morning. I'll have security escort you out if you try to take any proprietary files." The room went completely silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Sitting next to Julian was his wife, Sienna, a sharp, ambitious real estate broker who was 6 months pregnant and glowing with what she clearly thought was her upcoming elevation to executive wife status. She was a genuinely talented woman, someone who'd built her own successful career selling high-end properties. But right now, she was looking at me with an expression that made my stomach turn. Not sympathy, not surprise, triumph. My mother, Melora, reached over and patted Julian on the arm, her diamond bracelet catching the light. She looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes I'd known my entire life. "We just think it's time for you to step down, dear," she said in that saccharine tone she reserved for moments when she was about to say something cruel. "You're 34 years old and still single. Running a company is incredibly stressful for a woman your age. Julian is married, he's starting a family, and he needs to provide for them. You should be happy for your brother. This is what's best for everyone." I looked at the stack of legal documents resting near the gravy boat. I looked at my smug brother, then at my father, Darius, who sat at the head of the table with his arms crossed, playing the role of the silent, powerful patriarch who just orchestrated what he believed was the master stroke of the century. And then I simply smiled. I reached for the serving spoon and calmly added another scoop of sweet potato casserole to my plate. The utter lack of panic on my face seemed to irritate Sienna. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the expensive mahogany table, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the chandelier light. "I already have an interior designer coming in Tuesday morning, Tamsin," she said, taking a delicate sip of her sparkling water. "No wine because of the pregnancy. That corner office of yours has always been so incredibly drab and lifeless. It needs a complete overhaul now that a real executive is moving in. We're thinking rich mahogany wood accents, leather seating, maybe a custom wet bar for when Julian entertains high-profile clients. You understand, don't you? It's just business." I said absolutely nothing. I cut a piece of turkey, dipped it methodically in the cranberry sauce, and took my time chewing. Perfectly composed, not a tremor in my hands, not a tear in my eyes. The lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Sienna even more. She wanted tears. She wanted me to beg or scream or throw a crystal glass against the wall in a fit of hysterical rage. Instead, I was eating dinner. "Let's be brutally honest here, Tamsin," she continued, her voice taking on an edge. "You're 34 years old and completely alone. You have no husband, no children, and frankly, no life outside of that warehouse. It's actually sad to watch. It's time someone with a real family took the reins of this company. Julian has a baby on the way. He has a legacy to build. What exactly are you building for?" I swallowed my food and looked directly at her. Sienna was smart, genuinely brilliant at what she did. She'd sold multi-million-dollar homes to celebrities and executives, navigated complex commercial real estate deals, and built an impressive reputation. But she'd made one massive miscalculation when she married my brother. She'd assumed our family had generational wealth. She'd looked at the giant suburban mansion, the luxury cars in the driveway, my parents' country club memberships, and assumed Julian was heir to an empire. What she didn't know, what Julian had apparently never told her, was that I was the one paying for most of it. I was the one who'd been quietly funding their lifestyle for years. Julian was essentially a trust fund kid without an actual trust fund, surviving purely on our parents' willingness to enable his delusions of grandeur and my profits. "You should view this as a blessing," Sienna continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Julian is going to offer you a very generous severance package out of the kindness of his heart. 2 months of your current base salary. You can take that money and finally go on a vacation. Go to Bali or Tuscany. Do one of those eat, pray, love retreats. Find yourself. Maybe find a man who can actually tolerate you, because sitting behind a desk running a logistics company clearly hasn't done anything for your personal life." My mother nodded enthusiastically from her end of the table, dabbing at her lips with her monogram napkin. "Sienna is entirely right, sweetheart. We're doing this for your own good, so please don't be difficult. You've been looking so tired and aged lately. Those dark circles under your eyes are just terrible. Now you can focus on softening up a bit. Maybe join my gardening club or take a cooking class. Learn to be more feminine." I took another slow, deliberate bite of my dinner. The turkey was dry. My mother had never been a good cook, despite having every advantage money could buy, but the psychological warfare happening at this table was absolutely delicious. They were all waiting for the massive emotional explosion. My father sat back with his arms folded, a slight smile playing at his lips. He honestly thought he'd outsmarted me, used the very company I'd bled for to set up his golden boy for life. Julian smirked, drumming his fingers on the table with theatrical impatience. "So, are we going to do this the easy way or the hard way, Tamsin? I have a security team ready to box up your personal items this weekend. You don't even have to come into the building and embarrass yourself. Just hand over your company laptop and the office keys right now, and we can finish this nice Thanksgiving dinner as a family. No hard feelings." I carefully placed my fork and knife down on my plate, laying them parallel to each other with precision. I picked up my linen napkin and politely dabbed the corners of my mouth. The silence in the dining room stretched taut like a rubber band about to snap. I could hear everything now. The grandfather clock in the hallway, the wind rattling the windows, someone's shallow breathing. I think it was my mother, anticipating my breakdown. I looked at the stack of legal documents one more time. The official transfer of ownership, the 51% majority share, the sacred piece of paper they thought was their golden ticket to the wealth I'd built over 13 years, 8 freelancing, 5 with the LLC. Then I looked back at Sienna, whose perfectly contoured face was frozen in an expression of arrogant triumph. She really believed she was going to be the wife of a millionaire CEO by Monday morning. She'd already spent the money in her head, already envisioned the private school for her unborn child, the luxury vacations, the social status. It was almost a shame to ruin her perfectly crafted fantasy. Almost. My father finally shifted in his leather chair at the head of the table, the antique wood creaking beneath his weight. He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table, giving me a look that could only be described as victorious. For my entire life, Darius Whitfield had viewed me not as a daughter, but as a high-performing asset. When I was younger, I was the trophy he paraded around when I brought home straight A's and academic awards. When I started EcoShift, I became the reliable workhorse that generated impressive cash flow he loved to casually mention at his country club dinners. But a daughter, in his traditional worldview, was never meant to wear the crown. That honor was reserved exclusively for the son. "You have to look at the bigger picture here, Tamsin," my father said, his voice rumbling with false authority. He was 62 years old, and every year of his mid-level corporate career showed on his face. "You built a nice operation. We're all very proud of you for that. But you've reached your ceiling. You don't have the aggressive instinct required to scale a national supply chain company. Julian does. He has the vision. He has the killer instinct. We're simply stepping in to protect the family asset before you run it into the ground with your overly cautious strategies." I watched him justify the theft of my life's work with the casual indifference of a man returning slightly defective shoes to a department store. He genuinely believed his own words. He believed that my 13 years of grueling labor, missing holidays, losing sleep, fighting off competitors, were nothing more than a warm-up act for Julian to step in and claim the glory. My mother nodded vigorously, pouring herself another generous glass of white wine. The bottle was nearly empty, I noticed. She'd been drinking steadily throughout dinner. "Your father is absolutely right," she chimed in, her jewelry clinking as she moved. "You should actually be grateful we let you play businesswoman this long. Most families wouldn't have been so supportive of a single woman taking such massive financial risks. We gave you a beautiful sandbox to play in, Tamsin, but playtime is over now. The adults need to take charge." Play businesswoman. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I'd personally secured multi-million-dollar contracts with Target, Whole Foods, Nordstrom, and Sephora. I'd negotiated complex shipping rates that saved hundreds of thousands in overhead. I'd kept the lights on and payroll funded during a global supply chain crisis while Julian was busy losing money on cryptocurrency scams. And my own mother reduced all of it to a little girl playing in a sandbox. Sienna reached over and placed her manicured hand on Julian's, intertwining their fingers. "We're going to take such good care of your little project, Tamsin," she cooed. "You don't need to worry about logistics and supply chains anymore. You can finally rest." Julian leaned back, resting his arm over the back of his chair, looking every bit the conquering hero. "So what's it going to be?" he asked, his tone sharp and demanding. "Are you going to hand over the keys right now and walk away with your dignity, or are we going to have to make a scene on Monday morning? Because I promise you, I have absolutely zero problem having security carry your cardboard boxes out to the parking lot in front of your former employees. Your choice, sister." The arrogance in the dining room was suffocating. They honestly believed they'd cornered me. They thought they'd outsmarted the workhorse, taken the 51% controlling interest, and stripped me of my own company. Or so they desperately wanted to believe. I didn't break eye contact with my brother. I reached for my wine glass, holding it delicately by the stem, and took a long, slow sip. The Cabernet was rich and heavy, and it tasted like absolute victory. I set the glass down on its coaster with deliberate care. Then I turned my head slowly, shifting my gaze away from Julian, away from Sienna, away from my mother. I locked my eyes directly onto my father, the man who'd orchestrated this entire corporate coup, thinking I was too naive to see it coming. The man who'd spent the last 18 months meeting with his lawyer, requesting detailed financial projections, whispering with my mother about securing the legacy. I'd noticed everything. Every suspicious conversation, every side glance, every calculated move. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, watching the smug satisfaction slowly begin to drain from his weathered face as he realized I wasn't crying, wasn't screaming, wasn't begging. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table, and tilted my head. "Should I tell them now, Darius?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly steady. "Or would you like to do the honors?" The entire room went dead silent. My father let out a harsh bark of laughter that echoed off the high dining room ceiling. He shook his head, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms over his chest. He didn't look intimidated at all. He thought I was just a desperate woman trying to cling to her dignity before being thrown out. "There's nothing to tell, Tamsin," he said in that deep, booming voice he always used to intimidate people. "You can try to spin this however you want, but the facts are right here in black and white. The paperwork is completely ironclad. I had my personal attorney draw it up and review everything. You're out. Julian is in. That's the end of the story, so accept reality." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, locking eyes with me. "Let me remind you how this business actually started. 5 years ago, you came to me because the bank refused to approve your commercial lease for that first warehouse. You had no credit history, no real assets. You were completely stuck. I'm the one who stepped up. I co-signed that $50,000 loan to get you off the ground." My mother nodded, sipping her wine. "We saved you from total financial ruin before you even started," she added helpfully. My father pointed a thick finger directly at me. "Exactly. And in exchange for taking on that financial risk, I made sure my name was placed on the original operating agreement of EcoShift Logistics, LLC. I legally owned a 51% controlling interest from day one. I let you run the day-to-day operations because you were competent enough. But make no mistake, Tamsin, I have always been the majority owner, and I have the absolute legal right to transfer my shares to my son." He spoke with such absolute, unshakable conviction. He genuinely believed that a $50,000 loan from 5 years ago gave him the right to steal a company now worth millions. He conveniently left out the part where I'd paid back every single penny of that loan within the first 2 years, with interest. He left out the fact that I was the one who'd worked those 90-hour weeks sleeping on a cot in the warehouse. In his mind, his signature on a bank document was worth more than my blood, sweat, and tears. Julian smiled wide, showing all his perfectly white teeth. He reached out and placed his hand flat on top of the legal transfer document, sliding it across the table until it stopped right in front of my plate. "Read it and weep, sister," he mocked, tapping the top page with his index finger. "The state has already processed the transfer. It's a done deal. You don't have a leg to stand on. If you try to fight this in court, my lawyers will bleed you dry until you can't even afford groceries. So take the severance, pack up your desk plants, and disappear. Don't ruin this holiday for us." Sienna chimed in, looking at her nails with bored expression. "You really should listen to them, Tamsin. It's honestly pathetic to watch you try to act tough. You're a single woman with zero leverage. Julian is the future of this family. Just sign whatever you need to sign and let us finish this beautiful Thanksgiving meal in peace. I'm starving, and this tension is terrible for the baby." I looked down at the document sitting in front of my plate. The official seal of the state was stamped on the front page. The signatures of my father and brother were scrawled at the bottom in thick blue ink. They had executed the transfer according to the letter of the law regarding limited liability companies. They thought they'd trapped me in a flawless legal cage. I didn't touch the paper. Didn't even look at it for more than a few seconds. Instead, I slowly reached down beside my chair and picked up my leather tote bag. I unzipped the top compartment and pulled out my tablet. The screen reflected the warm glow of the chandelier. I took my time, wiping a small smudge off the glass before entering my passcode. I tapped the mail icon and scrolled through my sent folder until I found a very specific message. It was a company-wide memo I'd sent exactly 3 weeks ago. I placed the tablet flat on the table right next to the thick stack of transfer documents Julian had just shoved in my face. I spun the screen around so it was facing him directly. "Read it," I said softly. Julian rolled his eyes, leaning forward with an exaggerated sigh like I was wasting his incredibly valuable time. He looked down at the bright screen. Sienna leaned over his shoulder, her diamond earrings swaying. My father stopped chewing his turkey, suddenly annoyed that his victory lap was being interrupted. Julian began to read the email out loud, his voice starting flat but quickly growing amused. "To the entire staff of EcoShift Logistics, LLC, please be advised that effective immediately, I will no longer be serving in the capacity of Chief Executive Officer for this specific limited liability company. I will be transitioning to a new role and stepping away from the daily operations of this LLC. Thank you for your continued dedication." Julian stopped reading and let out a loud, booming laugh. He threw his head back, his face turning slightly red with genuine amusement. Sienna joined in, a wide smile spreading across her face. Even my father chuckled, wiping his mouth with his napkin. "Are you actually serious?" Julian asked breathlessly, pointing at the tablet. You sent this 3 weeks ago. You already quit. My mother clapped her hands together, looking absolutely delighted. Oh, Tamsin, that's wonderful news. See, Darius, I told you she would eventually see reason. She knew she was in over her head. She knew you were going to step in and fix things, so she just bowed out gracefully. That shows a lot of maturity, sweetheart. I'm actually very proud of you for recognizing your own limitations. Julian was still laughing, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't believe you tried to sit here and play it cool like you were some kind of victim. You knew this was coming. You probably saw the lawyer sniffing around and realized Dad was making his move. So you tucked your tail between your legs and sent a pathetic resignation email before we could officially fire you. You just wanted to save face in front of the warehouse workers. Sienna leaned back in her chair, looking at me with pure, unadulterated pity. It's better this way, Tamsin. Really, it is. Now you don't have to suffer the embarrassment of being escorted out by security. You quietly stepped down. That's exactly what a smart woman who knows she's beaten would do. You surrendered. My father pointed his fork at me, nodding with satisfaction. This makes the transition much smoother, he declared in his booming voice. Tomorrow morning, Julian can just walk in and take the corner office. No fuss, no drama. You did the right thing for once, Tamsin. You stepped aside for the good of the family. I let them have their moment. I let them bathe in their false victory. I let them savor the sweet taste of what they thought was my ultimate defeat. It's a rare and beautiful thing to watch arrogant people construct an entire reality based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the facts. I reached out and gently pulled the tablet back toward me, shutting off the screen with a soft click. The dining room fell quiet again as they waited for me to admit defeat and ask for my severance package. They waited for the tears. They waited for the apology. I rested my hands flat on the table and looked directly into Julian's eyes. I didn't resign, I said, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the lingering tension in the room like a surgical blade. Julian's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. A tiny flicker of confusion crossed his face. What are you talking about? He asked, his tone suddenly defensive. You just showed me the email. You stepped down as CEO of EcoShift Logistics, LLC. You admitted it right there in writing to the entire company. Yes, I did, I replied calmly, never breaking eye contact. But you clearly don't understand what that actually means for your immediate financial future. I watched my brother stare at me with a blank expression. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to get rich quick with cryptocurrency and internet schemes, but he knew absolutely nothing about actual corporate law or how real businesses were structured. My father was equally lost in this specific arena. He thought owning 51% of a piece of paper made him an untouchable business tycoon. They'd both severely underestimated how much I'd learned over the past 13 years of swimming with actual corporate sharks in the real business world. Let me give you a free business lesson, Julian, I said, keeping my voice low and conversational, almost friendly. A limited liability company is essentially just a legal container. It holds whatever assets and liabilities you choose to put inside it. I paused, taking a sip of my wine, letting the words sink in. When I started EcoShift Logistics 5 years ago, I put everything into that specific container. The warehouse lease, the equipment, the payroll system, and eventually the lucrative client contracts. That's the specific container our father co-signed the original $50,000 loan for. That's the container he legally owned 51% of. Julian scoffed heavily and crossed his arms over his expensive suit jacket. Right. The very container that generates $8.5 million a year in gross revenue. Thank you for the recap, Professor. Are you done stalling now, or do you have more pointless metaphors to share? I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. Not anymore, Julian. The smile on his face began to fade. 18 months ago, I continued, my voice taking on a sharper edge, I realized that my proprietary supply chain software, the actual technology that makes EcoShift so incredibly valuable, was legally vulnerable. I also noticed that our father was suddenly spending an awful lot of time asking my accounting department for long-term financial projections, having very long lunches with David Morrison, his attorney, whispering with Mother in corners at family gatherings. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I saw this exact hostile family takeover coming from a mile away, so 12 months ago, I hired a premier corporate restructuring firm out of Chicago to completely rebuild my entire operation from the ground up. It cost me $75,000 just for the initial consultation. Every penny was worth it. I leaned forward slightly, making sure every word landed. I didn't just step down from EcoShift Logistics LLC. I legally established a brand new entity, a Delaware C corporation called EcoShift Global Incorporated. And over the past 6 months, I've been very busy methodically emptying out the old container. The room had gone completely silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed to have stopped ticking. I legally transferred all of the intellectual property, including the custom routing software I coded from scratch over 8 years, directly to the new Delaware corporation. Since I was the sole creator and the old operating agreement never explicitly claimed ownership of my independent software code, that transfer was perfectly legal and completely airtight. My father dropped his fork. It hit his fine porcelain plate with a loud, sharp clatter that made my mother jump. "What exactly are you saying to us, Tamsin?" he demanded, his voice suddenly stripped of its booming patriarchal confidence. "I'm saying that my new Delaware corporation owns the technology," I replied, keeping my tone dangerously light and pleasant. But I certainly didn't stop there. I pulled my tablet back toward me and tapped the screen a few times, pulling up a document. I turned it around so they could all see the letterhead. Target Corporation. Every single one of my major vendor contracts, Target, Sephora, Whole Foods, Nordstrom, all had standard force majeure clauses allowing for corporate restructuring. They also all happened to have renewal dates scattered throughout the third quarter of this year. Sienna's hand, which had been resting on her pregnant belly, slowly moved up to her throat. "I met personally with each vice president of supply chain," I continued. "I explained that I was restructuring the business entity for better corporate governance and future growth. Same team, same service level, better legal structure. And since they'd been working with me, not with EcoShift Logistics LLC, but with me personally, for years, they were more than happy to sign brand new 3-year contracts." I looked directly at my father. Under EcoShift Global Incorporated, my new corporation, the one I own 100% of, the one your lawyers have absolutely zero legal claim to. The dining room became so incredibly quiet that you could hear the autumn wind rustling the dead leaves outside the windows. Sienna slowly lowered her wine glass to the table, her hand visibly shaking. She was a real estate broker. She understood contracts. She understood asset transfers. She was the first one to fully realize the sheer magnitude of what I'd just done to her husband. Julian looked down at the thick stack of legal transfer documents sitting proudly next to the gravy boat. He stared at the official state seal, the piece of paper he genuinely thought made him a millionaire executive. His face began to lose its color, turning a sickly shade of pale gray. "You didn't steal a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, Julian," I said softly, leaning forward so he could hear every single syllable. "You stole an empty shell." I let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "The company you just claimed majority ownership of doesn't own the operating software. It doesn't own the corporate branding. I trademarked that separately under my personal name 2 years ago, and as of 30 days ago, it has exactly 0 active client contracts. There's no revenue coming in on Monday morning. There's no revenue coming in next month. You just proudly took over a completely hollowed out corporate husk." Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his expensive silk tie. He looked over at our father, who was suddenly intensely interested in the wood grain of the mahogany table. But Julian wasn't ready to surrender. His ego had always been his biggest blind spot. He puffed out his chest and pointed an accusing finger directly at me across the table. "You're lying," he stammered, trying desperately to sound authoritative. "You can't just take the clients and run. Besides, the LLC still has massive physical assets. I've been to the industrial park, Tamsin. I've walked through that 50,000 square foot facility. I know we own the entire fleet of delivery trucks. I know we own the automated sorting machines on the warehouse floor. You can't fit a forklift into a new corporate filing. Those physical assets belong to the company I now control. You're just trying to scare me." I smiled slowly, leaning back in my dining chair. I crossed my legs and looked at him with genuine cold amusement. "You're absolutely right, Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even and calm. "The limited liability company you now control still holds every single one of those physical assets. You own the exclusive right to use the facility. You own the right to operate the delivery trucks. You own those expensive sorting machines." Julian let out a loud, dramatic breath of relief, looking over at Sienna with a triumphant grin. "See," he said to his wife, "she's just bluffing. We still have the entire infrastructure in place. We can hire a new sales team and sign new clients by end of month. We have the foundation we need." Sienna didn't smile back at him. She was staring directly at me, waiting for the other shoe to drop. As a high-end real estate broker, she knew exactly how commercial leases worked. She knew I was nowhere near done. Yes, you have the infrastructure, I agreed, reaching down into my leather tote bag one more time. But you see, Julian, physical assets in a logistics business don't just exist in a vacuum. They come with corresponding financial obligations. And I pulled out a thick manila folder stuffed to the brim with documents heavily stamped with red, urgent ink. I tossed it casually onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy thud that made my mother flinch. Go ahead, I offered, gesturing toward the folder. Open it. Take a good, long look at your shiny new empire. Julian hesitated. His hand hovered over the folder for several seconds before he finally flipped it open. The very first page was a final legal notice from the commercial real estate company that owned the warehouse property. That 50,000 square foot facility you mentioned, I said casually, taking another sip of my wine, it's not owned by the company. It's leased, and that expensive commercial lease is up for its mandatory renewal on December 1st, 8 days from now. Julian flipped rapidly to the next page, his hands beginning to shake. Because the old company just lost all of its major clients, the corporate landlord is demanding a substantial new security deposit to renew the lease. That's standard practice when there's a significant change in the tenant's financial stability. I watched him scan the numbers, his eyes growing wider. And those automated sorting machines you were just bragging about? I continued, my voice ringing clear through the silent room. They require mandatory annual maintenance and strict software licensing fees, which are due next week. Add in the fleet vehicle insurance premiums, 12 trucks need commercial coverage renewed, the general liability insurance, and the deferred state business taxes from the previous quarter that become due upon ownership transfer. My father finally spoke up, his voice incredibly tight and strained. How much, Tamsin? Exactly how much is owed? I looked right at my father and delivered the exact number, $950,000. And every single penny of it is due within the next 14 days. The color completely drained from Julian's face, leaving him looking physically ill. He stared blankly at the stack of invoices, the tax documents, and the commercial lease renewals spread out before him. $950,000, he whispered, his voice cracking horribly. The company doesn't have that kind of cash lying around. I nodded slowly in complete agreement. You're absolutely correct. The old company bank account has exactly $1,247 left in it. I legally transferred all the operating capital to my new corporation to appropriately service my new vendor contracts. That leaves your new limited liability company entirely insolvent. Julian looked up at me, pure panic swimming in his eyes. We'll just declare bankruptcy then. We'll dissolve the company tomorrow morning. When I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and gave him a terrible predatory smile. You can't do that, Julian. Did you even bother to read the transfer documents you signed this morning? I reached over and flipped to page 4 of the document stack, tapping a specific paragraph with my finger. When you eagerly accepted the 51% controlling interest and proudly named yourself Chief Executive Officer, you also accepted the role of primary personal guarantor for all corporate debts. That's standard language in any LLC operating agreement when there's a transfer of majority control. The dining room was dead silent. Even my mother had completely stopped breathing. That means the creditors won't just go after the empty company, I explained, watching his perfect world completely collapse. They're going to go after you personally. They'll go after your personal bank accounts. They'll go after your car, your house, anything of value you currently hold. You didn't just steal my company, Julian. You volunteered to personally assume nearly $1 million in debt, and you signed an ironclad contract saying you'd pay for the privilege. Sienna didn't say a word at first. She sat frozen in her expensive dining chair, staring at the mountain of invoices and legal notices on the table. Her eyes darted between the numbers printed in bold red ink and the terrified face of her husband. Then, suddenly, she lunged across the table. Her hand snatched the thick stack of transfer documents right out from under Julian's trembling fingers. She pulled the paperwork toward her and began flipping frantically through the pages, her professional training kicking in. Sienna, Julian stammered, his voice weak. Stop it. You don't need to look at those. We just need to figure out a strategy. Shut your mouth, Julian, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. Don't say another word until I finish reading this. My mother shifted uncomfortably, looking back and forth between her golden boy and his furious wife. Sienna, dear, please lower your voice, she pleaded, trying to maintain control. Darius will call his legal team on Monday and we'll get this sorted out. Tamsin is just trying to intimidate. I said be quiet. Sienna snapped, not even looking up from the documents. She reached the 4th page and her finger stopped dead on a specific paragraph. Her face turned an ashen shade of gray. She slowly lifted her head and looked directly at my father. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of absolute disbelief and raw, mounting fury. "You absolute idiot," she whispered, staring at my father like he was a stranger. "You let him sign a full assumption of liability clause. You transferred majority ownership without conducting a single audit of the corporate accounts. You handed your son a financial live grenade and told him it was a gold mine." My father puffed out his chest, trying to regain dominance. "I secured the family legacy," he barked defensively. "The infrastructure alone is worth millions. We'll restructure the debt. It's standard business practice, Sienna. You're overreacting." Sienna let out a dark, bitter laugh that sent chills down my spine. "Restructure the debt?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Darius, you can't restructure a commercial lease default when the new primary guarantor has a credit score of 620 because of failed cryptocurrency investments. I read these clauses every single day in my work. The corporate landlord required a personal guarantee for that facility lease. When Tamsin stepped down and Julian took over as CEO, that personal guarantee instantly transferred to him." She slammed the paperwork onto the mahogany table, pointing an accusing finger at her husband. "Julian didn't just inherit a logistics company," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "He legally assumed every single penny of its outstanding debt. They have a legally binding document that says my husband will pay them out of his own pocket. Do you understand what you've done?" Julian grabbed the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. "But I don't have $950,000, he choked out, looking wildly around the room at his parents. "I don't have any liquid cash. Mom, Dad, you know I don't have that kind of money." Sienna stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. She didn't even flinch at the noise. She stepped toward Julian, her entire body vibrating with a terrifying cold rage. "You don't have liquid cash, Julian," she said, her voice dangerously low and steady, "but you do have assets, or at least you used to." I watched the entire scene unfold with quiet satisfaction, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my wine. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and the financial ruin was no longer theoretical. It was a physical weight pressing down on their chests, suffocating them in real time. Sienna knew exactly what those creditors would come after first. And judging by the look of pure terror creeping onto Julian's face, he suddenly realized what she was about to reveal. She turned her entire body to face her husband. "Tell her what you did, Julian," she demanded, her voice cold as ice. "Tell your brilliant sister exactly how you managed to convince your father to hand over the majority ownership today, because we both know Darius doesn't just give things away for free." Julian reached out, grabbing her wrist in a desperate attempt to silence her. "Please, Sienna," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "Don't say it. We can fix this. Don't do this right now." She yanked her arm out of his grasp with such violent force that her water glass rattled against the table. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "You looked me dead in the eyes and promised me that your father was handing you the keys to a gold mine." My parents sat perfectly still. My mother looked down at her lap, suddenly unable to meet anyone's gaze. My father cleared his throat loudly, shifting his weight in his chair. The united front they'd so proudly displayed just 30 minutes ago was rapidly fracturing into jagged pieces. "Since my husband is suddenly incapable of speaking, I'll tell you, Tamsin," Sienna said, turning her burning gaze toward me. 2 weeks ago, Julian came to me with this brilliant master plan. He said your father was finally ready to push you out, but Darius wanted financial security for his retirement. Julian convinced me that if we bought out your parents' original equity stake, they would sign over the controlling interest immediately. He said it was the investment opportunity of a lifetime. I slowly set my wine glass down, a new layer of this twisted betrayal unfolding before my eyes. "You bought them out?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "With what money, Sienna? Julian doesn't have a trust fund, and he's never held a steady job for more than 18 months. Sienna let out a harsh, bitter sound that was half sob, half laugh. "We used our house," she said, her voice breaking. "Julian convinced me to take out a $300,000 second mortgage on our home. I'm a real estate broker, Tamsin. My entire career relies on my credit rating and my property investments, but I trusted my husband. We leveraged our home, and we gave all of that cash directly to your father." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. My father suddenly looked very uncomfortable. He reached for his water glass with a shaking hand, avoiding my eyes completely. It was a standard buyout agreement, he mumbled defensively. Julian wanted skin in the game. I needed to know he was serious about taking over the family business. It was a perfectly legitimate transaction. Legitimate! Sienna screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. You took $300,000 from your own son to hand him a bankrupt shell of a company. You let us mortgage our entire future to buy a mountain of debt. You knew Tamsin was making moves. You had to have known something was wrong, but you just wanted to cash out before the ship sank, and you let your own son go down with it. The horrific reality washed over the table like a tidal wave. Julian hadn't just accepted a toxic asset, he'd paid a massive premium for it. And my parents, who loved to preach about family loyalty and legacy, had eagerly taken that money, knowing full well they were screwing over their favorite child just to line their own retirement accounts. If those creditors call in the debts, Sienna continued, her voice trembling violently, they're going to come after the new majority shareholder. They're going to see the equity in our home. They're going to place a lien on my property. She turned to look at Julian with pure disgust. You didn't just ruin your own life, Julian. You destroyed my business, my credit, and my home all in one single afternoon. She took a step back from the table, her hand protectively on her pregnant belly. This was supposed to be our secure future, our child's future. Now it's a financial nightmare that will haunt us forever. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother let out a sharp gasp, pressing her hands against her cheeks. She looked at my father, expecting him to somehow magically fix this disaster. But my father was no longer sitting back with that smug patriarch smile. The reality of what he'd done, taking $300,000 from his own son for a worthless company, had completely shattered his illusion of control. He knew that if creditors came after Julian, and if Sienna filed for divorce, that money would be dragged straight into bankruptcy court. His perfect retirement fund was suddenly a massive legal liability. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple. He slammed his fists onto the table, causing the china and crystal to rattle violently. He stood up, towering over the table, his chest heaving. But he didn't yell at Julian or Sienna. He turned his burning rage entirely toward me. You did this on purpose, he roared, pointing a thick, shaking finger at my face. You planned this entire thing. You deliberately stripped the company of its valuable assets to leave your brother holding the bag. You set us all up. I looked up at him, completely unbothered. I took a slow bite of my dinner, chewing thoughtfully before answering. I simply protected my own intellectual property and my own vendor relationships, I replied, keeping my voice calm and even. You're the one who decided to transfer ownership without doing a shred of due diligence. You're the one who let your son leverage his home to buy a hollowed-out company. I didn't set you up, Darius. Your own greed set you up. My father was breathing heavily, his nostrils flaring. He looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an escape. You think you're so smart with your new Delaware corporation and your sneaky asset transfers? He snarled, his voice dripping with venom. But you forgot who you're dealing with. I have corporate lawyers on retainer. He leaned across the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. I'm going to sue you for breach of fiduciary duty, he threatened. As the former CEO of the LLC, you had a legal obligation to act in the best financial interest of that business. Transferring all the assets to a competing firm you personally own is textbook corporate malfeasance. I'll have my lawyers file an emergency injunction Monday morning. We'll freeze every bank account your new corporation holds. We'll drag you through court until you're bankrupt. My mother nodded aggressively. Your father will do it, Tamsin, she spat. You've crossed a line. You don't just steal from your own family and walk away smiling. Julian looked up, a small glimmer of desperate hope returning to his pale face. Yes, he croaked, his voice weak. We'll take it to court. We'll prove you illegally embezzled company assets. I sat there, listening to their desperate, pathetic threats. They honestly believed they still held a winning card, and then I began to laugh. Not just a chuckle. I threw my head back and let out a genuine, ringing laugh that echoed off the dining room walls. It was the laugh of a woman who'd spent years walking on eggshells, suddenly realizing she was completely invincible. My laughter seemed to shock them more than anything else I'd done tonight. You think you can sue me for breach of fiduciary duty? I asked, wiping a genuine tear from my eye. I reached into my bag one final time and pulled out a single crisp piece of paper. I placed it firmly on the table and slid it across until it rested directly next to the transfer documents. Do you remember 2 months ago, Darius? I asked, keeping my voice conversational. I bought you that all-expenses-paid luxury golf trip to Cabo San Lucas. Flew you out first class. booked you the presidential suite, even paid for your unlimited bar tab at the clubhouse. My father stared at me, not saying a word. You spent 5 days down there living like a king while I managed a supply chain crisis back here. You even posted photos on social media, bragging to your country club friends that you were the mastermind behind EcoShift, that you deserved the vacation. I tapped the paper in front of him. But I didn't send you to Mexico because I felt generous. I sent you there because I needed you distracted and relaxed. On the 3rd day of your trip, you were playing the 14th hole overlooking the ocean, at least 4 margaritas deep based on your Instagram post. I sent you an email. Sienna let out a sharp breath, her eyes widening. As a broker, she knew exactly where this was going. The subject line said it was a routine administrative update for annual tax filings. You didn't want to stop playing golf to read a boring legal document. So you opened the DocuSign link, scrolled to the bottom, and used your thumb to digitally sign your name. You didn't read a single paragraph. I looked directly at him. But the software logged your exact IP address, your geographic location in Cabo, and the precise second you legally bound yourself to those terms. My father's hands were trembling as he picked up the paper and began reading. "Read the second paragraph out loud, Darius," I instructed. He didn't speak. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. "Fine, I'll read it for you," I said, reciting the clause from memory. "The majority shareholder hereby explicitly authorizes the unrestricted transfer of all intellectual property, custom software architecture, and existing vendor contracts from EcoShift Logistics, LLC, to EcoShift Global, Incorporated. Furthermore, the majority shareholder permanently waives any right to contest this transfer, litigate against the founder, or claim breach of fiduciary duty in any future legal proceedings." My mother gasped loudly, clutching the pearls at her neck. "Darius," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. "Tell me you didn't sign that. Tell me she's lying." My father slowly lowered the paper. The arrogant patriarch who'd just threatened to destroy my life was completely gone. He looked like a deflated balloon. The document in his hand was ironclad, legally binding. His own lawyers would take one look at that digital signature and tell him he had no case. "You gave me the keys to the castle while you were getting drunk on a golf course," I said, a cold smile spreading across my face. "You explicitly approved the entire asset transfer. You legally signed away your right to sue me. There will be no emergency injunction Monday morning. There will be no lawsuit. You have absolutely no legal recourse." Julian looked like he was going to be physically sick. He turned to our father, his eyes desperate and pleading. "Dad," he choked out, his voice shaking, "tell me we can fight this. Tell me you have a plan." But my father had nothing. He'd spent his entire life underestimating me, and that fatal flaw had just cost him everything. Before anyone could speak, the doorbell rang. The loud electronic chime cut through the suffocating tension like a knife. It was 5:45 on Thanksgiving evening. Nobody was expecting guests. The sudden noise made Julian jump out of his chair like he'd been shocked. For a brief moment, everyone just stared at the archway leading to the foyer, paralyzed. Then my mother sprang into action. This was her salvation, an excuse to stop talking about federal tax fraud, corporate bankruptcy, and stolen retirement funds. She needed an audience to play her favorite role, the perfect suburban hostess. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, her voice suddenly an octave higher. "That must be the Harrisons with their pecan pie." She frantically wiped the tears from her cheeks, smoothed her silk dress, and forced her facial features into a bright, welcoming smile. The transformation took less than 10 seconds. It was honestly chilling to witness. "Everyone, compose yourselves," she hissed over her shoulder as she rushed toward the foyer. "Darius, fix your tie. Julian, wipe your face. We'll deal with this after the guests leave." I didn't move. I simply stood in the archway, arms crossed, waiting to watch the final piece fall into place. My mother reached the large double doors and pulled them open with a flourish, ready to greet the neighbors. "Happy Thanksgiving," she sang out, her voice dripping with false cheer. But it wasn't the Harrisons standing on the front porch. A man in his late 40s stood in the harsh porch light, wearing a plain gray suit that looked slightly wrinkled. He had a thick winter coat pulled tight against the cold and was holding a heavily taped manila envelope under his arm. My mother froze, her smile faltering. "Oh," she stammered, taking a half step back. "I'm sorry. I thought you were someone else. Can I help you?" The man didn't smile. He looked down at a device in his hand, verifying the address. "Good evening, ma'am. I am looking for Julian Whitfield. Can you confirm this is his primary legal residence?" My mother's grip tightened on the door. "Who's asking?" "I'm a process server," the man replied. I need to make direct contact. Is he on the premises? Julian had heard his name. He walked slowly toward the foyer, his face still pale and glistening with sweat. Who is it, Mom? What's going on? The man stepped past my mother without hesitation, holding the envelope out. Are you Julian Whitfield? Yes, he answered, his voice barely a whisper. I'm Julian. What is this about? The man thrust the envelope directly into Julian's chest. You've been officially served. Have a pleasant Thanksgiving. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the cold autumn night, pulling the door shut behind him with a firm click. Julian stood frozen in the foyer, holding the envelope like it was covered in poison. My father came out of the dining room, his heavy footsteps echoing. Sienna followed, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Open it, my father commanded, his voice rough. Open it now and tell me what it says. Julian fumbled with the tape, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the package. He finally ripped it open and pulled out a stack of legal documents covered in bold black text and stamped with an official court seal. As he read, all remaining color drained from his face. His knees buckled slightly and he had to lean against the wall. What is it? Sienna demanded, stepping closer. Stop reading to yourself and tell us. It's the landlord, Julian choked out. The commercial real estate company that owns the warehouse. They filed an emergency legal injunction this afternoon. My father grabbed the papers from Julian's hands and quickly scanned them, his face twisting into a mask of horror. When you filed the corporate transfer documents this morning, Julian, I said from the doorway, my voice echoing calmly in the space, you triggered an automatic legal clause in the commercial lease agreement. The landlord requires the primary guarantor to have proven pristine credit history to maintain a facility that size. Sienna let out a sharp, bitter laugh, covering her mouth. The automated risk assessment software flagged the transfer immediately, I continued. The real estate company realized the new CEO was high risk and that the vendor contracts were gone. They're not taking chances. They're demanding a security deposit, my father read aloud, his voice trembling. Because the new tenant failed the financial background check, they're invoking the emergency protection clause. How much? Sienna asked, her voice devoid of sympathy. My father looked up, his eyes wide with panic. $180,000. They want a certified cashier's check for exactly $180,000 by Monday morning at 9 a.m. And if he doesn't pay? Sienna pressed, stepping into my father's personal space. My father looked back down at the injunction, his hands shaking. If the funds aren't secured by deadline, the landlord will immediately change the locks on the facility. They'll legally seize every physical asset inside, the trucks, the sorting machines, everything. They'll liquidate the equipment to cover the broken lease. Julian let out a pathetic whimpering sound, sliding slowly down the wallpaper until he was sitting on the cold hardwood floor. The brilliant illusion of his corporate empire was dead. No clients, no operating cash, and by 9 a.m. Monday morning, no physical building. His pregnant wife had just promised to divorce him. His parents had drained his finances to line their own pockets. The worst Thanksgiving of his entire life was culminating in his total, utter destruction. The silence in the foyer was broken only by the sound of my brother's ragged, shallow breathing. But as the reality of his impending destruction fully settled over him, something inside his fragile mind finally snapped completely. He scrambled up from the hardwood floor, but his legs couldn't support his weight. Instead, he practically crawled across the expensive Persian rug, closing the distance between us until he was directly at my feet. He threw himself down onto his knees right in front of me. He reached out with his trembling, sweaty hands and grabbed the hem of my silk coat. "Tamsin, please," he sobbed, his voice breaking into a high-pitched wail. "Please, you have to save me. You have the money. Your new corporation has millions. You can easily write them a check Monday morning and make this all go away. Please don't let them take everything." I looked down at the top of his perfectly styled hair, now completely ruined and plastered to his forehead with cold sweat. "Let go of my coat, Julian," I commanded, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. He didn't let go. He gripped the expensive fabric tighter, burying his face against his hands as tears flowed freely down his face. "I'll do anything," he begged, his words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "I'll completely step down. I'll publicly sign the company back over to you immediately. I'll come to your new office and work for absolutely free. I'll clean your office. I'll scrub the warehouse floors on my hands and knees. I'll take out the garbage every single night. Just please pay the landlord. I can't go to federal prison. I can't lose everything I have." My father took a hesitant step forward, clearly horrified by the pathetic sight of his only son begging like a stray dog. "Get up, Julian," he barked, trying to inject authority back into his voice. "Have some dignity. We'll call the lawyers and figure this out." My brother whipped his head around to look at our father, his face red and covered in tears. "There's nothing to figure out," he screamed, his voice echoing violently off the high ceiling. "You gave me a dead company, Dad. You stole my money and handed me a death sentence. There are no lawyers who can magically fix a commercial lease default by Monday morning. Tamsin is the only one with the operating capital." He turned back to me, looking up with those desperate, pathetic eyes. "Please, Tamsin," he whimpered again. "We're blood. We're family." I took a deliberate step backward, ripping the hem of my coat out of his sweaty grasp. "You stopped being my family the second you tried to steal my life's work," I said, looking down at him with pure, cold disgust. "You wanted to be CEO, Julian. You wanted the power and the prestige and the corner office. Well, the crown is entirely yours. Enjoy the empty warehouse before they lock you out of it." Suddenly, another sound cut through his pathetic sobbing. It was sharp and heavy, the sound of expensive metal hitting polished wood. Everyone turned their heads back toward the dining room. Sienna had walked back to the Thanksgiving table. She was standing perfectly straight, her face an absolute mask of cold, calculating resolve. She'd just violently yanked her massive diamond wedding ring off her finger and slammed it directly onto the mahogany table right next to the useless corporate transfer documents. "Sienna, what are you doing?" he choked out, his eyes wide with fresh terror. She ignored him completely. She reached into her designer purse and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped the screen a few times and lifted the device to her ear. We all stood there in absolute silence, listening to the line ring. "Hey, it's me," she said, her voice totally flat and strictly professional. "I need you to come pick me up at the Whitfield house right now. No, don't get out of the car when you pull up. Just idle in the driveway. I'm leaving immediately." There was a pause as whoever was on the other end responded. "Yes, everything is completely ruined. I'll explain it all in the car." She ended the call and dropped the phone back into her purse, zipping it shut with a loud, sharp sound that felt incredibly final. "Sienna," he pleaded, holding his hands out toward her. "Please don't walk out on me. Not tonight. We have a baby. We can rebuild this together." She looked down at the pathetic man kneeling on the floor of the foyer. Her expression held absolutely zero love and zero pity. "I am not rebuilding a single thing with a fraudulent, entitled coward," she said, her words slicing through the air like a razor blade. "I'm calling my attorney first thing Monday morning. I'm officially filing for divorce, and I'm aggressively pursuing full legal custody of my child. Do not try to call me. Do not try to follow me. You are completely dead to me, Julian." With her final piece spoken, she turned on her heel and walked purposefully toward the heavy double doors. She opened them without hesitation, stepped out into the freezing autumn night, and left them all behind to rot in the nightmare they'd created for themselves. The cold draft from the open door lingered in the foyer for a long moment. My brother remained frozen on his hands and knees, staring blankly at the empty space where his wife had just stood. The silence in the house was absolute and suffocating. My mother didn't rush forward to comfort her precious golden boy. My father didn't offer a booming speech about family resilience. They were entirely broken by the magnitude of their own greed. I walked past my brother without looking down at him. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as I made my way back into the formal dining room. The atmosphere had completely shifted. The glowing warmth of the antique chandelier now felt harsh and unforgiving. The expensive Thanksgiving feast was totally ruined. The roasted turkey was cold. The crystal wine glasses were scattered haphazardly. The corporate transfer documents looked like literal garbage. I picked up my leather tote bag from the floor and placed it gently on the edge of the table. I stood perfectly straight, taking a deep breath of the sage-scented air. I felt an overwhelming sense of lightness washing over my entire body. The massive, heavy chain of family obligation that had dragged me down for over 3 decades had finally snapped. I was no longer the unloved daughter trying desperately to earn a scrap of validation. I was no longer the invisible workhorse pulling the weight of their suburban egos. But I wasn't quite finished yet. I reached into the side pocket of my tote bag and pulled out one more document, a thick red folder. My father slowly walked back into the dining room, his posture completely slumped. My mother followed right behind him, her eyes red and swollen. They stopped at the edge of the table, watching me with expressions of pure defeat. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice completely hollow. I didn't answer immediately. I laid the red folder flat on the polished mahogany wood and opened it. "This, Darius," I said, tapping the heavy cardboard cover, "is the complete transaction history of the secondary corporate credit card for EcoShift Logistics. The specific card you demanded I issue to Julian 2 years ago so he could entertain potential vendors. You told me it was a necessary business expense to train him for an executive role." My brother's head, which had been buried in his hands at the threshold of the dining room, snapped up. The sickly gray color of his face drained to ghostly white. He knew exactly what was in that folder. I opened the cover and pulled out the first page of highlighted bank statements. "Would you like to hear how your brilliant son has been entertaining vendors?" I didn't wait for an answer. Last March, he charged $14,000 at a VIP nightclub in Miami. He expensed it as a client dinner. I checked our corporate logs. We don't have a single vendor or client located within 500 miles of Miami. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. In July, I continued, flipping to the next page, he initiated a direct corporate wire transfer of $35,000 to an offshore cryptocurrency exchange. He categorized it in our accounting software as an international freight tariff. He used company money to buy unregulated digital tokens, which completely collapsed in value 3 days later. $35,000 of operating capital gone instantly. I pulled out a glossy receipt from a luxury boutique. And my personal favorite, last December, he used the corporate card to purchase a $12,000 diamond tennis bracelet. He classified it as a year-end bonus for a top warehouse manager. I looked directly at my mother. "I don't see a $12,000 bracelet on your wrist tonight, Melora. Do you?" My mother's face went pale. She understood the implication immediately. Her son had used company money to buy expensive jewelry for another woman while simultaneously begging his pregnant wife to mortgage their family home. "Additional charges," I continued, pulling out more receipts. $8,500 at a gentleman's club, expensed as vendor entertainment. $6,200 at a designer menswear store, expensed as business attire. $4,800 at an exclusive golf club that's not even the family membership. $3,500 at a day spa, expensed as a team wellness initiative. I looked up at my father. Total fraud, $47,000 over 24 months. My father sat entirely frozen. Even he hadn't known the full extent of his son's financial abuse. "You want to sue me for breach of fiduciary duty, Darius?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. "You want to drag my new Delaware corporation into a legal discovery process? Go right ahead. File the paperwork Monday morning." I placed my hand on the red folder, but the exact second your lawyers file that suit, I'm taking this folder and I'm handing it directly to the Internal Revenue Service. My mother slowly sank into her chair, completely defeated. "The federal government doesn't play games with corporate tax fraud," I explained, my voice cold and absolute. "Co-mingling personal luxury expenses with corporate accounts and writing them off as tax deductions is a federal crime. If you sue me, the IRS audits the old LLC. They'll immediately see that the CEO has been routinely embezzling funds and falsifying tax returns." I looked directly at my father. Julian won't just lose the company. He won't just lose his house. He'll be sitting in a federal prison cell for wire fraud and tax evasion. I let that sink in for a moment. "So tell me, Darius, do you still want to call your lawyers?" He didn't answer. He slowly lowered his eyes to the table, staring blankly at the polished wood. The great patriarch who'd ruled our household with an iron fist for decades had completely surrendered. He knew I had him perfectly cornered. If he tried to fight me in court to protect his ego, he would send his favorite son directly to federal prison. The illusion of our perfect, wealthy family finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces right there over the Thanksgiving turkey. But I still wasn't done. I reached into my purse one final time and pulled out like a sleek leather checkbook. I unzipped the gold zipper and pulled out a heavy fountain pen. The sound of the pen cap clicking off echoed loudly in the quiet room. "What are you doing?" he asked again, this time his voice barely a whisper. I laid the checkbook flat on the polished mahogany wood. I smoothed out the crisp paper of the top check. I pressed the metal tip of the fountain pen against the paper and began to carefully write. I wrote out the current date, I wrote the legal name, Darius Whitfield, and then I carefully wrote out the exact numerical amount, $50,000. 5 years ago, I said, my voice steady and clear, I came to you asking for help. I needed a cosigner for a commercial lease to start my business. You graciously provided your signature to secure a $50,000 loan. I continued writing in the memo line, loan repayment in full. You then used that single signature to legally bind me to your control. You held it over my head at every single family gathering. You used it as justification to constantly claim my success as your own personal victory. You used it as the excuse to steal my company today. I signed my name at the bottom of the check with a sharp, definitive flourish. I capped the fountain pen and slipped it back into my tote bag. I gripped the edge of the check and tore it away from the binding with a loud, satisfying rip. I held the crisp piece of paper in my hand for a brief second, looking at my father, who was staring at the check with a mixture of confusion and absolute dread. Then I reached across the table, holding the check directly over the centerpiece of their lavish holiday meal. I opened my fingers and let the paper fall. The check fluttered down through the air and landed directly on top of the cold, ruined Thanksgiving turkey. It sat there, resting against the glazed skin, an absolute symbol of our shattered family dynamic. There is the initial loan you gave me 5 years ago, Darius, I said, looking him dead in the eye. That's exactly $50,000 drawn directly from my personal corporate account. It clears every single financial debt I ever owed you. I zipped my tote bag closed and placed the strap over my shoulder. You can use it to help pay off Julian's commercial lease default, or you can put it back into your retirement fund. I honestly don't care what you do with it. My mother let out a small, pathetic whimper, covering her mouth. I looked at both of them one last time, committing their defeated faces to memory. Paid in full, I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. We are entirely done. I turned my back on them without waiting for another response. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I didn't rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a woman who had just conquered an entire kingdom and was casually strolling out of the burning castle. Behind me, the absolute silence of the dining room finally broke. It shattered like brittle glass under the weight of my mother's escalating hysteria. "Tamsin!" she shrieked, her voice vibrating with ugly, desperate rage. "If you walk out that door, you are completely dead to us. Do you hear me? You are absolutely dead to this family. We will never speak to you again. We will completely erase you from our lives." Her desperate threats echoed off the high ceilings, but they felt entirely weightless. They were just empty words thrown by a powerless woman who'd finally run out of ammunition. I didn't slow my pace. I didn't turn my head to look back at her. I simply reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door. I pulled it open and stepped directly over the marble threshold. The contrast between the stifling, toxic atmosphere of that house and the outside world was absolutely staggering. The crisp, cool autumn air hit my face instantly, clearing the lingering scent of roasted turkey and expensive perfume from my lungs. It was completely dark outside. The suburban street was incredibly quiet, lit only by the warm glow of street lamps. The tall oak trees lining the perfectly manicured lawns rustled gently in the cold November wind. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I stood on the front porch for a moment, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. Through the thick glass of the front door, I could hear the muffled sounds of absolute chaos erupting inside. My father was shouting at my brother. My brother was screaming back, crying hysterically. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably. The perfect, wealthy family was literally tearing itself apart in the foyer, and I was standing on the outside, completely untouchable. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the freezing air. The cold felt sharp and pure against my skin. For my entire life, I'd been taught to fear this exact moment. I'd been conditioned to believe that losing my family would be the ultimate tragedy. But standing there on that porch, listening to them destroy each other, I realized I hadn't lost anything of actual value. I had only lost a group of incredibly selfish parasites who viewed my existence entirely as a financial utility. I had shed a suffocating skin. I walked slowly down the brick pathway toward the driveway. My luxury SUV was parked at the curb, reflecting the streetlights. As I approached my car, I noticed Sienna's vehicle idling a few houses down the street. She was sitting in the passenger seat of her sister's sedan, staring straight ahead, one hand protectively on her pregnant belly. She didn't look back at the mansion either. We were both survivors of the same shipwreck, swimming away from the sinking vessel in different directions. I unlocked my car and opened the heavy driver's side door. The plush leather interior smelled like expensive, clean cedar. It smelled like my own hard work. It smelled like complete, absolute independence. I slid into the driver's seat and pushed the ignition button. The powerful engine roared to life with a low, satisfying rumble. I turned on the heated seats and gripped the smooth leather steering wheel. My hands were perfectly steady. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settling deep into my bones. I shifted the car into drive and slowly pulled away from the curb. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't take one last lingering glance at the massive brick colonial house that had been my prison for 34 years. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the road ahead of me. The dark suburban streets were empty, lit only by occasional street lamps. Every single mile I drove put more permanent distance between my brilliant future and their miserable, toxic past. I turned the heater up and let out a long, slow exhale. The night was incredibly dark, but for the first time in my entire adult life, I could see my path absolutely clearly. I pressed my foot down firmly onto the gas pedal and drove into the calm night, leaving the worst Thanksgiving of my life entirely behind me forever. 1 month later, I'm standing in the center of my brand new corporate headquarters. When I officially dissolved my ties with that toxic family LLC, I didn't just relocate my assets, I relocated my entire life. I moved EcoShift Global to a sleek, modern, high-rise building right in the heart of Manhattan. My new corner office features massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the New York City skyline. The afternoon sunlight pours into the open concept workspace, reflecting beautifully off the polished marble floors and the vibrant green plant installations. It's a brilliant space designed for genuine growth and collaborative innovation, not for family manipulation and petty power struggles. Today is the day before Thanksgiving, and instead of sitting at a toxic dinner table, I'm hosting a Friendsgiving celebration for my entire staff and the true friends who actually supported me. I brought in a premium catering company to set up a massive buffet of roasted turkey, garlic mashed potatoes, and fresh seasonal vegetables right in the center of our executive boardroom. The air smells like cinnamon, apple cider, and genuine happiness. I look around the spacious room and see the smiling faces of the people who actually matter. These are the loyal senior managers, the brilliant tech developers, and the dedicated warehouse supervisors who immediately resigned from the old company the second I told them I was leaving. They trusted my leadership so completely that they followed me without a moment's hesitation. They're laughing, sharing stories, and raising glasses of champagne. There's no underlying toxic tension. There are no secret agendas. There's no one at this table plotting to steal my equity. My lead software engineer, Natalie, walks over and hands me a fresh glass of sparkling cider. She clinks her glass against mine and offers a warm smile. "We have a lot to be thankful for this year," she says, her voice filled with sincere gratitude. I take a slow sip of the sweet drink and look down at the tablet resting on my glass desk. She's absolutely right. Just this morning, I finalized the paperwork for a Series A funding round. A major venture capital firm from Silicon Valley had been tracking my corporate restructuring. They were so impressed with my efficiency and flawless financial ledgers that they officially valued EcoShift Global at $32 million. They just wired $12 million of liquid operating capital directly into our accounts to help us expand into the European market. I'm no longer just surviving the daily grind. I'm actively building an international empire completely on my own terms. I don't have a narcissistic father looming over my shoulder, constantly claiming credit. I don't have a manipulative mother telling me to shrink my ambitions. I am the sole founder and undisputed CEO, and absolutely nobody can ever take that away from me again. As for my family, the aftermath was exactly as devastating as I'd calculated. On Monday morning at 9 a.m., the commercial real estate landlord executed the emergency injunction. My brother showed up to the facility in his expensive suit, only to find security guards at the chained gates. They handed him a formal notice of asset seizure. The fleet trucks, the sorting machines, and the entire physical infrastructure were liquidated to cover the broken lease. By Wednesday afternoon, EcoShift Logistics LLC officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Sienna was a woman of her word. She filed for emergency divorce that Monday morning. During discovery, her attorneys entered those credit card receipts into public court record. The judge was unimpressed by a man who'd mortgaged his marital home to buy an empty company while buying a $12,000 bracelet for another woman. She stripped him of every remaining asset, forced the sale of their property, and walked away with full custody of her unborn child. Last I heard, she just closed a record-breaking commercial real estate deal and bought herself a beautiful townhouse downtown. My brother, he's currently working a $15 an hour retail job at a home improvement store, stocking plumbing supplies and being supervised by a manager 10 years younger than him. My parents tried desperately to protect their golden boy. When the IRS initiated a forensic audit after the bankruptcy, they hired expensive corporate defense attorneys to keep him from federal prison. But elite legal representation costs a fortune. To pay the federal tax penalties and astronomical lawyer fees, they were forced to completely drain their retirement trust fund. Even that wasn't enough. 2 weeks ago, their massive brick colonial mansion was quietly put on the market. They had to sell it just to keep my brother out of an orange jumpsuit. They now live in a cramped 2-bedroom condominium on the edge of the city. My father had to resign his country club membership. The wealthy men he used to brag to now avoid eye contact with him. My mother dropped out of her exclusive social clubs, humiliated by their spectacular fall from grace. And me? I walk over to the massive glass window and look down at the busy city streets far below. A year ago, I was suffocating under the oppressive weight of family expectations. I believed that my success was somehow a burden I had to apologize for just to keep the peace. But standing here, I am entirely free. I slowly turn back to face my team. The beautiful sounds of their laughter and clinking glasses fill the room. This is what real family looks like. For so long, I was conditioned to believe that family was strictly defined by biology and shared last names. I was taught that blood was a binding contract that forced you to endlessly tolerate disrespect, manipulation, and outright theft. But that's a complete lie. True family is not an obligation you're born into. It's a conscious choice you make every single day. True family celebrates your victories instead of trying to diminish them. True family doesn't view your hard work as a communal bank account to be raided whenever they make a terrible decision. When people hear my story, they assume my greatest revenge was the flawless corporate trap I set. They think the ultimate payoff was watching my brother lose everything, or watching my parents drain their retirement fund. But the money was never the point. The greatest and most exquisite revenge I ever achieved was the quiet realization that I simply no longer care what any of them think about me. For 34 years, my entire sense of self-worth was tethered to their conditional approval. Their opinions dictated my happiness. Their constant criticism kept me locked in an invisible psychological cage. But the second I walked out of their front door and stepped into that freezing autumn air, that heavy chain shattered. I evicted them from my mind, and the profound silence they left behind is the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. If you're feeling trapped by the suffocating weight of a toxic family dynamic right now, I need you to listen carefully. You do not owe your life to people who refuse to respect you. You do not owe your success to relatives who only reach out for financial bailouts. You are allowed to set ironclad boundaries. You are allowed to pack your bags, walk out the front door, and never look back. Don't let anyone weaponize your guilt against you. Cut off the toxic leeches draining your potential and use that energy to build your own magnificent empire. You deserve to sit at a table where your presence is genuinely celebrated, not just financially tolerated. The best revenge is always building a wildly successful life completely without them. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. If my story resonated with you, or if you've had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories about resilience, boundary setting, and personal triumph. Share this video with someone who desperately needs the courage to finally choose themselves. Remember, the people who are meant to be in your life will celebrate your success, not try to steal it. Until next time, choose yourself. Always choose yourself.